everybody, welcome to the channel. My name is Mike Gaudette, and today I want to talk about diminished major 7th chords. So these are very unique sounding chords that we don't see very often, but we do encounter them from time to time in jazz music, and there are some rare instances of these chords popping up in non-jazz music as well. But for today, I want to focus on how diminished major 7th chords are typically utilized in a jazz context. And once you understand how to construct these chords and how to use them, it will open up a whole new world of different sounds and textures that you can utilize both in your comping as well as your solo chord melody playing. So this video is going to be split up into 3 parts. For part 1, I'm going to show you how these chords are constructed and then show you a variety of different 4-note voicings, mostly starting on the 4th string root, but I will also show you one that is starting on the 5th string root as well as one that starts on the 6th string root. And then for part 2, we're going to talk about how diminished major 7th chords are typically used and how they resolve themselves into major 7 chords. And then for part 3, I'm going to take you through a handful of different jazz standards, and I'll show you some examples of melodies where you can substitute a major 7 chord for a diminished major 7th chord, which will give you, like I said, a whole new set of different sounds that you can implement into your chord melodies and your comping. So hopefully by the end of this video, you have a lot of new ideas that you can explore with your chord playing. So starting out, let's just talk about the formula for a diminished major 7th chord and how it is constructed. Okay, so to me, one of the easiest ways to visualize this chord is if we start out with a major 7th chord and then we alternate the appropriate notes to turn it into a diminished major 7th chord. So I find that it's really easy to do it off of this voicing of G major 7. So I'm putting my pinky on the G note, the 5th fret of the D string. Then I put my ring finger on B, the 4th fret of the G string. Then my middle finger goes on D, which is the 3rd fret of the B string. And then my pointer finger is going to play F sharp, the 2nd fret of the E string. So that's G major 7. Now what I like about this voicing is it just goes right up 1, 3, 5, 7 in terms of the intervallic makeup of this chord. So that's a major 7th chord, 1, 3, 5, 7. So now if we think about the name diminished major 7th, it tells you everything that you need to know right in the name. So we know that the major 7th stays the same, but we need to make it into a diminished chord. So diminished means flatted 3rd and flatted 5th. So we take the B and D note right here and we have to flat them to B flat and D flat. So now rather than this, we play this. So G, B flat, D flat, F sharp. The frets are 5, 3, 2, 2. I'm barring my pointer finger on that 2nd fret. And one thing I think is important to clarify before we get into more of these voicings is what the different types of diminished 7th chords are, because oftentimes we hear diminished 7th, half diminished 7th, and now diminished major 7th. So the difference between this and the other 2 types of diminished chords is when we have a fully diminished chord, a diminished 7th, which is how it's typically named, the formula for that is 1, flat 3, flat 5, double flatted 7th, which would be our open E string. So this, that would be just a straight G diminished 7th. And then you also hear the term half diminished. So half diminished is the same thing as minor 7 flat 5. Now what that means is it's 1 flat 3 flat 5 and then flatted 7th, which is the F note. So this is a little bit of a stretch. But, you know, if you can't get it down here, it's not the end of the world. I'm just telling you this more just to clarify the differences between different types of diminished chords, because there are a few of them. And a lot of times people do get confused with what name means what. So just to quickly reiterate, so diminished major 7th is 1, flat 3, flat 5, major 7th. Fully diminished 7th is 1, flat 3, flat 5, double flatted 7th. And then half diminished, which is the same as minor 7 flat 5, is 1 flat 3 flat 5 flat 7. Okay, now one other thing I want to mention before we get into more of these voicings is typically there can be 2 different ways that you name a diminished major 7th chord. So if we take that G diminished major 7th chord that we were doing, if we leave the root note out and we just look at the top 3 notes, it's actually an F sharp major triad. If you think of like an F sharp bar chord, it's just the top 3 notes of that chord. So because of that, sometimes people will name this chord F sharp over G, so they'll write it as a slash chord rather than saying diminished major seventh. So if you think of it in terms of a slash chord, it's basically taking whatever the root note of the chord is, in this case it's G, and then that's going to be your bass note, and then the upper notes are going to be a major triad a half step down. So if you think of the key of G, a half step down from G is F sharp, right? So this is an F sharp triad over G. I typically prefer to call it diminished major seventh, but everybody seems to be a little bit different when it comes to how they like naming their chords. And oftentimes, you know, you can have a chord that could be named two different ways. You can either name it as a slash chord, or you can just name it with its regular name starting on the root note. So I just wanted to clarify that before we go any further. But for this video, I'm going to be naming all of these chords diminished major seventh. But one of the things that I do really like about knowing that little trick, taking that major triad and going down a half step, is it makes it really easy to build these voicings all throughout the neck. If we just take our F sharp major triad and move it through the inversions, we can find a wide variety of different diminished major seventh chords. So this would be our first one, which we already talked about. So this is starting with the G note on the bottom, and we have the major seventh on top. All right, now the next one would look like this. If we take this F sharp major triad and we move it up to the next inversion, it would be this. Looks like the shape of a D chord. So now we're going to take that, but we're going to put a G note in the bottom. So we have pointer finger on G, middle finger on D flat, pinky on F sharp, and then ring finger on B flat. So intervallically, that's root, flatted fifth, major seventh, flatted third. So this one has the flatted third on top. Okay, now another one, if we take this F sharp major triad and go to the next inversion, we would have this. So this one, in order to get the G note on the bottom, I have to do it on the 5th string rather than the 4th string. So I'm putting my middle finger on G on the 10th fret of the A string, then I skip a string, then I put my ring finger on F sharp, pinky on B flat, and pointer finger on D flat. So that's root, major seventh, flatted third, flatted fifth. Another cool voicing. So far we have these three. Now, one other one that we can do, which also has the major seventh on top, is this. So this one, I put my pointer finger on D flat, my middle finger on G, then pointer finger is barring to get the B flat, and then my pinky plays F sharp. I like that one a lot. So that's flatted fifth, root, flatted third, major seventh. All right, so those are 4 different diminished major seventh voicings in the key of G. So to recap, we have this. Okay, now a couple of other ones that are worth noting. I typically find that the most voicings that you can get out of these do tend to start in that general area, but there are a couple that we can also do on the 5th string and the 6th string, which are worth noting. So for the 5th string, I'm going to do it in the key of C. So I'm going to take my C, and then above it, you can see the B major. Just think of a B chord. It's basically just like taking a B chord, and you move your pointer finger up a fret to C. All right, so that's the root, flatted fifth, major seventh, flatted third. And then one other that I really like that starts on the 6th string would be this. We're going to take our, basically think of like this. You're taking a B major chord, and you're taking the B note, and you're moving it up to C again. So this one is middle finger on C, you skip a string, put your pinky on B, put your ring finger on E flat, and pointer finger on F sharp. So that's root, major seventh, flatted third, flatted fifth. Okay, so those are 6 different examples of diminished major seventh voicings. Now you're probably wondering, where do these chords fit in over a song? Because they do have a pretty tense and dissonant sound, and there's a reason for that. So these are typically utilized as passing chords, and passing chord means that it is a type of chord voicing that is meant to resolve to another chord. You're not typically going to hear a song that's centered around a chord like this. It's always meant to go somewhere else. Obviously, there are exceptions, and people have probably written songs that are centered around a diminished major seventh chord, but that's certainly not the norm. So now for part 2, I want to talk about how these chords typically resolve themselves. Okay, so like I had mentioned, typically diminished major seventh chords function as passing chords and they resolve themselves to a different type of chord voicing. So most of the time when we see this, the most common way that they resolve themselves is they go from a diminished major seventh chord into a major seventh chord. So if we go back to the first voicing that we talked about, this G major seventh chord right here, and we said how if we just take the third and fifth and lower it, that makes it a G diminished major seventh chord. It offers a nice sort of resolution back into the major seventh because all we have to do is take these two notes and you go back up a half step and it resolves back to a major seventh chord. So now I'm going to take all of the voicings that we went through in part one and I will show you how they can resolve to a major seventh chord. So the first one, we take the diminished major seventh and then go back into the major seventh. So all of a sudden now that tension from that first chord has a purpose because it's going somewhere. And all of these are going to resolve to a G major seventh chord. So if you know your G major seventh chord and all the different inversions, that will help out a lot with this. So that's our first one. Now for this second one, we're taking this voicing right here. Now to make it a G major seventh chord, we have to take these two notes and move them up a half step. So we go from this to this. All right, that's a nice one. In that one, the top note is going up a half step. With this first one, the middle notes were going up, but this one we have movement on one of the middle notes and one of the top notes. Okay, now the next one, this one's probably the trickiest one in terms of just the fingering and the voicing. So this one we have to move the top two notes up a half step. So if we do that, we go from this to this G major seventh voicing. That's nice because of the upper movement in the upper notes. Okay, now this last one that we talked about right here, this one we have to move the D flat and B flat up a half step. So now we go from this to this. That's also really pretty. Okay, so all four of these movements would be this. Okay, now if we do the same thing with the other two voicings, the first one starting on the 5th string root and then the other one starting on the 6th string root. So this one is not too bad. So we take this C diminished major seventh and we want to resolve it to a C major seventh. So these two notes, this F sharp and E flat, both have to go up a half step. So we have, okay. Now this final one, up here, this C diminished major seventh, the top two notes have to move up again. The E flat and F sharp have to go up to E and G. So this one goes from this to like the stock C major 7 voicing. Okay, so to review all 6 of those resolutions, we have So I would say the majority of the time that you encounter a chord like this over a jazz tune, it's almost always going to end up resolving itself to a major 7th chord. Of course, like I said before, there are always exceptions to all of these rules, but in terms of the most typical use of these voicings, I would say this is the most common way that you're going to encounter them, going from a diminished major 7th chord into a major 7th chord. And sometimes a jazz standard will actually use it as part of its harmony, or other times you can use it as a substitution. So the next question then would be, when do we use these voicings in a standard? Where do they pop up naturally, and where can we use them as a substitution? So now for part 3 of the video, I'm going to take you through a handful of different jazz standards where we can utilize some of these diminished major 7th voicings. And this is going to really open up a whole new world of sounds for your chord playing. So now time for part 3. All right, so now I want to talk about a couple of different examples where you will encounter these chords over jazz standards. In some instances, they are part of the harmony. In other instances, we can use them as a substitution. So I want to take you through a couple of those right now. So one great example of a song that uses a diminished major 7th chord is Corcovado in bars 5 through 8. It does a 2-5-1 to F major, and it does G minor 7 for a bar, C7 for a bar, and then rather than just resolving to F major, it starts with the F diminished major 7th, and then it goes down to an F6 chord, which is another cool example of how it can resolve. I had said previously in the video that it typically resolves to a major 7th chord, but a major 6th chord is one of the other most common uses in terms of how it resolves itself. So if we do that over this song, we would have this. So that's a beautiful sound. So we take that F diminished major 7th, and then we resolve it to the F6. So both of those notes are in the melody of the song. So it fits perfectly with the way the melody lines up. And it's nice because when you resolve it to the 6th chord, you have that descending motion in the top of both chords. And a lot of times if you see this written in the real book, they might just call it F diminished 7th, but as you could see, the major 7th is in the melody. So technically, if you were doing a chord melody and harmonizing it, it would be a diminished major 7th voicing. So that's one example. Now, another great instance where you can use this is over the Cole Porter tune, I Love You. So the beginning of that song has a really interesting melody. It goes... Now that one spot, if you notice, if you look at the chart, on the F major 7th chord, the first note is actually a G sharp, which is technically the sharp 9 or the flatted third. So anytime you see an instance like that where you see like a major chord that has a flatted third or sharp 9 in the melody, that's a perfect spot to do the diminished major 7th. And as you can see, it resolves up to an A note. So it's a perfect spot to use those voicings that we had talked about. So in this instance, we would go... and then... right? So that works perfectly with the melody because we have that sharp 9, then we move it up to the major 3rd. And if we look at all of those different diminished major 7th voicings and we look at the notes that are on the top, that can offer some good insight into how we can use these chords as substitutions. So for example, if I just took those 3 voicings that we started out with, this G diminished major 7th, it has the major 7th note in the top, so that tells us that anytime we have a melody that starts on the major 7th of a chord, we could technically substitute it for a diminished major 7th if that's the type of sound that we're going for. And just like we said with the tune I Love You, same thing. I'm in the key of G now, but if we take that other voicing, we notice we have the flatted third on top. So if we see a major chord with a flatted third, that's a perfect spot to substitute that. And then the one other one would be if we take this voicing, we have the flatted 5th or sharp 4, whatever you prefer to call it. That's on top. So if we have a major chord with that particular note on top, we could also use that as a substitution. So a lot of it is just being mindful of the melodies that we're playing in standards and just being aware of whether or not these types of chords can be substituted with the melodies that we're playing. So one tune that is a great example of where we can do that is I Remember You. It starts on an F major 7th chord, and the first melody note is an E note, which is the major 7th. So this is a perfect example of a spot where we can substitute it with a diminished major 7th because the top note of the chord is the major 7th. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to take the voicing that I did in Corcovado down here, but I'm going to switch it to the 5th string root. So this is a little bit of a stretch, and we didn't cover this one in part 1, but this will be another new voicing for you to implement. So this one, you put your pinky on F, ring finger on A flat, pointer finger on B, and middle finger on E. So I would go like this. So I start with the diminished major 7th, then I play the F, and then I just resolve to a regular F major chord when I get to that C note. So the way this particular melody lines up works really well with this substitution. So not every single melody is always going to work well with this particular kind of chord movement, but in this instance it resolves itself nicely between the diminished major 7th and the major chord. So Okay, another example, and this is probably one of the most common examples of where this chord can be used. A lot of people like to do this over the first chord of Misty because, again, it's E flat major 7 and the melody note is D, which is the major 7th. So you'll see a lot of people go like this. I'm going to take the same voicing I did for I Remember You and just move it down 2 frets to the key of E flat. So you would go. And then you resolve it to the E flat major 7th. So another tune where a lot of people do add this chord in as a substitution, and this one is really important to know because it is commonly used, is Stella by Starlight in the later part of the song where we have that G7 sharp 5 section. So you have G7 sharp 5, then the C minor, then A flat dominant sharp 11, and then right here, the real book just says B flat major 7th for 2 bars, but a lot of times people will do the B flat diminished major 7th for a bar and then go to B flat major 7th just to give you a little bit more movement, a little bit more stuff to play around with. So if we were to do that over that particular part of the tune, we can go. Variety in terms of the harmonic movements. And if you're doing a chord melody for this particular part, the melody goes, it has the natural 9 on top. So this is a pretty cool voicing just to be aware of that you can do this with. So if you just think of this voicing, the B flat major, diminished major 7th, you just take the upper 3 notes and you put your pinky on C. So I guess you would technically call that like B flat diminished major 7th 9 or something like that. I don't know what the exact name of the chord would be, but it's basically a diminished major 7th with a 9 and it's rootless. If you want to get the root, you can take your thumb and go like that. It's a little tricky, but you can do that. But that resolves nicely. You go. Then you move it up to a rootless B flat major 9. All right, now another example of a standard that starts with the major 7th in the melody is the song Tenderly, which is a beautiful standard. So that is oftentimes played in the key of E flat major, and it has these 3 pickup notes, and then it hits the D note on beat 1. So that's an E flat major 7th chord with the D note, the major 7th, in the melody. So we can go like this. So we do that. Diminished major 7th voicing from before and then resolve it to just regular major 7th. Now one other example that I like a lot is the standard Where or When, another beautiful song that I love playing. So this one is oftentimes played in the key of E flat major, and this one it has this really nice ascending melody where it goes from the 5th to the 6th and then to the major 7th. So again, once we have that major 7th, that's a perfect spot to throw in the diminished major 7th chord. So in this instance, we would go like this. Another bar, so it's perfect because we can resolve it back to the regular major 7th on bar 4. So okay, so those are just a handful of different examples of where you can implement these over some different jazz standards, but of course there are many, many more that I didn't cover in this video. But now that you understand sort of the way to implement these chords, basically finding any sort of major chord that either has the major 7th, the flatted 3rd or sharp 9, whatever you prefer to call it, or the sharp 11 or flatted 5th in the melody. And those are perfect spots where you can use these as, you know, passing chords or chord substitutions, and it'll give you a whole new set of sounds that you can implement now into your chord melodies and into your comping. So that is it for the video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable and informative. And if you are not already subscribed, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It helps out a lot. And please feel free to check out some of the other videos on my channel if you are interested. I have multiple other videos doing some lessons on other different types of chords and how they function. And if you're interested in any of my lesson videos for sale at mikesmasterclasses.com, I will have a link for free samples for all of those lesson videos that I've made so far in the comments and in the description. So be sure to check those out. All right, that's it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.